this is Heather Luna, and welcome to K-Doozy Cast, where we talk about all the things standing in the way of us learning how to take care of one another and keep each other as safe as possible, particularly within the kind of collapse-driven communities that many Western white middle-class people find themselves in. Not everyone, of course, but those are the kinds of things we talk about here. And you can find me at kdoozy.org, as well as on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and I've got some occasional videos on YouTube and some Twitch. So welcome to this episode of K-Doozy Cast. Hey, so I'm really happy to welcome Peter Wicks. Hello, Peter.
Hi, Heather.
And so one of the workshops I run is on tone policing. And that's usually in the context of, well, I learned about it from Layla Syed's book, Me and White Supremacy. And it's around how there's kind of this white middle class politeness that shuts Black, Indigenous people of color down by saying, oh, if you're angry about something, we can't hear you unless you're speaking politely to us. But in addition to that, I've noticed, as I'm mixed heritage, so Latina on my dad's side and white European heritage on my mother's side. So I am in some spaces that are just Black, Indigenous people of color, and some spaces that are just kind of white spaces, white middle-class Western spaces. And I notice a huge difference between the two. With the BIPOC spaces, everything's really relaxed and fun, and we swear and we just kind of say what we're feeling. And in the white middle class Western spaces, it feels so controlled. And I wouldn't necessarily say performative, which we do hear that word a lot to describe people who want to look anti-racist, kind of thing. I mean, this seems broader. Like it could be a space with all white people and it's very controlled. What do you make of that kind of? I know you're in those spaces as well, so I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Okay, so I'm going to think really carefully about this, not just say what I want. It does depend. So, I mean, one thought that I have is that when we're trying to control the way that we're communicating, there has to be some kind of fear mechanism in play. It's like we're afraid of saying the wrong thing. We're afraid of expressing ourselves in a way that is not in conformity with some kind of role. Now, obviously, that can sometimes be a good thing. If the alternative is that you're going to say something that's really harmful, then, well, better to be controlled. So I guess the question for me would be actually two questions. One is, why do we need to control ourselves and the way we express ourselves to avoid saying something harmful? And secondly, at what point does that actually become part of the problem? So, you know, when is it better to keep a conscious control on how we're expressing ourselves? And when is it better to just loosen up and say whatever comes into our heads?
So when you mentioned fear right away, it made me think of the white supremacy culture patterns that come up that I mentioned throughout many workshops, but they have their own workshops. Tima Okun's work on that, and we look at it in great detail in that particular workshop and the cult dynamics workshop. And so there's so much fear, as you say, of getting things right. Another pattern is perfectionism. So we don't want to seem to be wrong. And if there's a lack of reflection in the culture, then possibly there's that lack of humility and curiosity, which would make it okay to make the mistake.
Right.
It would make it okay to not have to control it so tightly. Mm-hmm. So remind me again, so the two questions that arise for you.
What is it that makes us dependent on control in order to avoid saying something harmful?
Okay, so for that one, could it be that people have an experience or a generational experience of being ostracized if they do the wrong thing?
For sure. And of course, it can also be other kinds of trauma that are playing out, thought patterns that, you know, we learn from our childhood or, you know, whatever, which are playing out and will play out unless we keep quite a tight rein on how we express ourselves.
Yeah, okay. So when I look at this like wall of of white middle-class Western people that are so tightly controlled, it's a lot of fear. And then your second question
is if there are times when it's good to be controlled because the alternative might be worse, you know, how do we know when to keep that control and when it's actually better to loosen up?
How do you answer that question for yourself when you're in those spaces?
So I think it will depend very much on how relaxed I am. But so this is not like me having a thought about when is it good to loosen up and when is it good to keep control. It's more when in practice do I loosen up, when in practice so if I'm feeling good and relaxed, then of course I'll loosen up because the fear mechanism just isn't there. Whereas if I'm feeling a bit cagey, then it's almost impossible to loosen up. So in one way or another, I'm going to be paying close attention to how I express myself.
Yeah, so I feel that way as well, that I feel a kind of confidence in, you know, like a groundedness in myself where I'm going to be myself. And probably for both of us, there isn't a danger of being cut off from people in these spaces, from people we need. Mm-hmm. Whereas someone else could the ramifications of doing the wrong thing could be larger. And I'm thinking more in terms of people with less power and privilege who need to be in those spaces. They will need to keep control. But yeah, I don't want to think too much about them, I'm thinking about the white middle class Western people and how they're so controlled. And so perhaps it's that, we talk about nervous systems a lot and regulation of nervous systems. And it could be that if you're not well regulated in your nervous system, then you won't have that confidence and that grounding in order to just be yourself. Mm-hmm. And so you're in a more controlled state. And the space itself, there's probably some maybe groupthink that goes on where if you're not very well grounded and you see everyone else being really controlled, you will see this is the way, this is the culture of this space, mm-hmm. is to remain very controlled.
Right.
You probably won't take that chance.
Mm-hmm. And if you do, you might just get slapped down in the sense that, and I mean, it may be, if the culture of the whole gathering is there are certain kind of rules to be respected, and then you contravene those rules, it's probably going to cause stress for other people. So it may actually be better not to, unless there's some particular reason why you're thinking, oh no, I really need to interrupt this. Whereas in another setting where it's all much more spontaneous, well, of course, it makes sense to be spontaneous yourself. So there's a kind of conformity which may actually be healthy because it's adaptive, as long as you're not kind of supporting or condoning an approach which is unhealthy in some way.
I suppose, we always have to remember the power and privilege that are involved in the space. So if there was an imbalance, and there always will be, it'll be impossible for it. Even if it's all women, there's going to be some kind of power dynamics going on. So I'm wondering, first of all, just the observation of how I guess, so I'd want people listening or watching to recognize that space that we've been describing will be deeply unattractive to some people. Mm-hmm. And so if you are trying to welcome more people into that space who have not been raised in that culture, I can attest that it looks like a very scary space. Mm-hmm. Because people don't seem very authentic,
right,
in that space.
Right.
So I would want to point out that people, like, you need to recognize, and that's where the tone policing comes in, because then it feels like there's tone policing going on. And so anyone that comes in that wants to say something and isn't going to be performative in that way, because for that person, it will really feel performative.
Right.
Because it won't feel natural to
mm-hmm.
to control everything in that way. And then separate from that, even if it stayed a white Western middle class space, I mean, white people are my people too, and I don't want people to have to be so controlled. I want people to experience what I get to experience in the BIPOC spaces, mm-hmm. which is just based on love and being relaxed, and there's like and can only speak from my own experience in these spaces, and there's more than one, it feels like there's a general understanding of something, and that's what ties us together, and that's what makes the space safe. And there will be tensions, and people have called each other out on things, and I say called them out. I don't know, there's different definitions of what calling out is. But if you're in a space and you're able to say, what you just said sounds like you're blaming me for whatever, I call that calling out. You might call it, I don't know, but it's not like a nice kind of very controlled naming of something. You know, it's more like I need to tell you what I just heard, and it was painful, you know. So I want my white people, my white Western middle class people, to be able to relax and connect with people in a way that they don't need to be kind of deciding what they're about to say, how it's going to look, being so careful. How do we support people in being able to create that own space for themselves?
I think part of the problem with this demographic, the white middle class, particularly, you know, quite highly educated. What do we mean by highly educated? We mean that we've been to university, we've been inculcated with a lot of language-based learning, which keeps us very much in our heads, very cerebral. We find it very difficult to express what is within in an authentic way. So in a way, I think the way that we, what you observe about those gatherings is actually a reflection of a much deeper problem than, you know, can be either solved by just changing the way we interact in those gatherings. We need to do work in really just getting much more connected, you know, mind and body, which there's a lot of work, but it takes a long time. And when there's fear, maybe we need to actually get better at expressing that fear. Like if we're freaking out, maybe we need to say that we're freaking out. We need to maybe learn to express that, you know, even physically, instead of being so controlled. Because the fear will be there, I think. It's difficult to get rid of the fear. Maybe we shouldn't be.
Yeah, so that's a good point, to just name where we're at. And model that. So, I mean, in my workshops, I try to include somatic exercises that I've, you know, learned from Resmaa Menakem about, you know, like when he's doing a one-to-one with someone and they, you know, start talking rapidly, or, you know, he's like, pause. You know, he notices we're getting into our heads, and he wants us to notice what's going on in our bodies. Maybe that's one simple intervention that could be made in these spaces, that could become part of the culture. Is that at the beginning of the meeting, you're reminded that this is what we're going to do. And I know in some spaces there are skilled facilitators who could then, stay aware of that. And I mean, sometimes they're not even aware of this going on. But if you had people that had, seen it modeled and then could interrupt people, like when someone's having their turn talking, it could become part of the culture that they're interrupted to allow that person to feel what they're talking about, and allow everyone to just kind of like, okay, yeah, okay, breathe, look around the room, regulate a bit. And this could serve as a way to co-regulate as a community.
Right.
What do you think?
Yeah, I think that all sounds good. And I was also thinking that when we're talking, we need to try to articulate what we're feeling, and we can do that with body language. We can do that by just making that part of what we're saying. So, for example, if somebody says something that causes us to feel a certain way, we can talk about that feeling that we're having in response to what the other person has said. So that there's then more of a connection between the conversation, between the words that are being used, and what is actually going on somatically in the people using those words. And that, I think, would help things to go a lot more smoothly.
Yeah, so we need to practice a kind of vocabulary of feelings, which reminds me of, I recently did a course on nonviolent communication for people of color. And that one, there is a list of feeling words. And I'm trained in the white supremacy culture. I don't know how to describe my feelings very well at all. And so getting into a habit of looking at that list and like, what am I feeling? Like, how would I describe it? And that's like just exercising a muscle on how to describe feelings. And we could even use that excuse, like use the excuse of like a normal gathering to talk about something. But really the goal is to periodically practice describing what we're feeling during that meeting. Yeah. It's like learning a new language, right? Right.
And also about feeling safe to use that language. So I think a lot of people find it very discomforting to talk about feelings. So somehow, and of course, the more we do it and the more we hear other people do it, the more we're going to feel safe doing it ourselves. But that's like a threshold that we have to go through. So at the beginning, you're probably going to have to say, right, for this part of the conversation, we're just all going to talk about how we're feeling. And not necessarily in the sense of doing a check-in, but we're just this is going to be what we're discussing. We're going to be discussing how we're all feeling, perhaps in relation to a particular issue that is controversial or whatever. And that way, I think the habits develop and people start to get more comfortable with that style of expression.
Okay, so there was something else, but I can't remember what I was going to say. So let me try to pull out what we've been saying. Like if we were going to make suggestions, it would be, I think, number one, to recognize that the way the current culture is in those spaces, the white middle class Western spaces, is not attractive to everybody. So any idea of making that space more welcoming, you'd need to keep that in mind. Number two would be to circulate a list of feeling words and have people practice using those words. And in facilitated spaces, those facilitators could practice interrupting, make it part of the culture that people do get interrupted to pause and go into like what's going on in their body and the feelings that are coming up. And that would be for the person speaking and also for everyone listening, because we can get very tense with that. And that would start to change the culture, perhaps, which would be regulating for the people in that group, and also might one day make that group more welcoming to people who don't find that space comfortable. Right.
And it would certainly be more authentic. Because what makes a space inauthentic, it's when there are feelings that are not being expressed. Because for one reason or another, the participants don't feel safe expressing them. So it's like we have to increase the safety of expressing. We have to increase the range of feelings that people feel safe to express, including anger, for example. That will make it more authentic, and I think that would also make it more attractive.
Absolutely, yeah. Anger is one of those tone policing, especially when someone's just been the target of a racist comment, to expect them to put on this kind middle class, demeanor in order to call someone in. Isn't realistic and is oppressive.
Right.
Yeah, so we need to get good at being able to hear anger so that we can still be able to listen to what the content is.
Right.
Okay, good. Thank you for that.
My pleasure.
And I'm sure there'll be more conversations to be had along these lines. And some people are listening to this, so I just want to point out that you're a white man, and the highly educated kind. I just did the quotation marks in the air. And your accent, your accent does confuse some people, but you are from England.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks, Peter. Speak soon.
Speak soon, Heather. Thanks.
So thanks so much for listening to this episode of K-Doozy Cast. This has been Heather Luna, and if you are able to make any sort of donation to help us out here in Colombia, every little bit goes a long way. So you can make a donation through the website, kdoozy.org, or you can do it through PayPal. And the username for PayPal is HeatherLuna1, and that's the number 1. Otherwise, do go to kdoozy.org to see what upcoming workshops we've got, and look for us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Medium, LinkedIn, Twitch, YouTube. Until next time, ciao.